Center video podcast live. We are broadcasting from Lviv and Kiev, where Mykola Bielieskov has joined us. Mykola is a senior research fellow at Ukrainian National Strategic Study Institute, if I pronounce it correctly, under under the leadership of the president of Ukraine. And he's also an analyst at the Comeback and Alive Charity Foundation, one of the most prominent Ukrainian charity foundations, which helps Ukraine to win this war. Welcome, Mykola. Welcome to this live broadcasting.
Thanks for the invitation.
And my first question is, and that is what is interesting for all of us, what is going on currently on the battlefield? You have posted recently, a few hours ago, a very interesting thread on your Twitter on the different views from the US side on did Ukraine do it right, not having a concentrated punch through the Russian defensive lines, like jeopardizing more losses, but maybe winning more success, or was it the right strategy to do smaller steps and having like tactical gains? What is the overall assessment?
Well, you referred to the ongoing debate about pros and cons of Ukrainian military strategy, and that's the development that is anticipated, I would say, and people are going to debate lively and extensively the decisions adopted, how this was that kind of decision prior to the Ukrainian offensive affected ongoing Ukrainian offensive. If we are talking specifically about ongoing Ukrainian offensive, so we managed to pass through so-called security zone in the area of Robotine, and we created so-called bulge salient, and we try to enlarge this so-called bulge. If we take, for instance, situation in this Robotine Verbova bulge, so we are trying to enlarge it to make it as wide as possible. And in process, of course, we are treating Russian forces. We are striking priority targets, so-called, like tube and rocket artillery, electronic warfare, air defense system, and we try to treat Russians as much as possible, preserving our own forces, and finally to create an opening to move forward, to move towards Tokmak.
Well, but if we like summarize the events of the last week, like not even weeks, the last week on the battlefield, we met with you like early June, and you have shared your insights with what is possible, what is not possible, where could be like the bottlenecks of this offensive. But what we have seen within the last week, we see that the Ukrainian army has achieved incredible success on hitting Russian high-value targets in Sevastopol, in Yevpatoria, in other regions where Russian naval ships have been hit, Russian naval docks have been hit, Russian high-value air defense units have been hit. And we have also seen since like the last like 2 weeks that the losses of Russian artillery have like skyrocketed with over 40 or even 50 pieces a day. We also see today the report of Ukrainian military intelligence that Russian soldiers, about like 170 soldiers a day, capitulate to the Ukrainian army. Are we witnessing now some sort of of a changing moment in this war when Ukraine is gaining like more chances to hate the Russian army and achieve like some significant success?
Well, there is a lot of developments, you mentioned them, but let us separate a little bit, because as for me, what's going on in temporary occupied Crimea, at sea, and what's going on the front line, these are more parallel stories. Definitely with like striking the Russian air defense system and opening ways to strike Russian military infrastructure in temporary occupied Crimea, it might positive effect and might create conditions for Ukrainians moving forward in southern mainland. But right here, right now, these stories are more like parallel stories. And if we are talking again about the front line, most analysts agree that the two most important factors is the balance of munitions and reserves. No one knows precisely this balance of munitions and reserves, but all agree that these two would be most important factors. And what is striking in this operation Ukraine conduct and the way Russian conducting defense in the Zaporizhia region, what is most striking is that they've thrown everything in the first line of defense, in a so-called security zone. Because if they follow textbook, they needed to slowly withdraw with fighting, slowly exhausting Ukrainian forces, preserving as much as possible of their own forces and equipment, and then laying conditions for counterattack. But what we've seen, they've thrown everything in the first line. That's why very little movement, very little change of territories. That is one of the reasons why, until recently, especially in the area of Robotyne, there was very little of movement. That's the situation going on the front line. If we are talking about development specifically in temporary occupied Crimea, at Black Sea, it's also very important developments, but they are more related to the freedom of navigation. They are more related in general to decreasing the capabilities of Russian Black Sea fleet. And as I said, the only possible connection is that if we open more ways to strike military sites in temporary occupied Crimea, on which Russian grouping of forces in Zaporizhia and Kherson region depends, then of course we would create more favorable conditions to move on. But right here, right now, these are kind of parallel stories more.
But if we stay a bit with the spectacular attack on the Russian naval facilities in the occupied Crimea, how was it possible to do it? Like the Russians finally, they acknowledged that several Ukrainian cruise missiles have hit their naval vessels. Was it like somehow connected with this spectacular operation of the Ukrainian special forces when they took control over the gas and oil rigs in the offshore platforms, which were probably the places where the Russians had their air defense radars or some sensors? Like, how was this operation possible?
Well, first of all, this kind of things they require weeks of planning, very detailed planning. It's not the kind of things that could be done like in a couple of days. So it's synchronization with a lot of elements. And yes, since this kind of missiles, they have very lower flight path, very lower one. It means that they might be detected uh, lately. I mean, a very little time for reaction response. And if we decrease this Russian situation awareness, depriving them of the situation awareness, it first allow us to do this launching, I suppose, somewhere near the coast of the Black Sea, not like striking from the depths of Mykola region, but maybe from the very coast, either in Mykolaiv or in Odessa regions, given the range of this Storm Shadow Scalp cruise missiles of 250 kilometers. So yeah, I suppose there is this kind of connection that deprived Russian of early warning, so-called, and left them with very little time to respond. That's why there was this, according to the Russians, quite a big salvo, because 10 missiles is quite a big salvo, and some of them managed to pass through it. But of course, it's a Russian statement. There might be a situation when there was the salvo of lesser degree of lesser scale, and the Russians didn't manage to intercept anything, given, again, this sea skimming capabilities of these cruise missiles, given stealth characteristics of these cruise missiles. That's why it's a very sophisticated operation. Yes, there is the direct connection with previous actions with depriving the Russians of situation awareness, and who knows how much of these missiles were used and how much Russians really intercepted.
Well, thank you for this insight. This is Mykola Bielieskov. We are talking live on YouTube from Lviv to Kiev, where Mykola is currently located. Mykola is a senior research fellow at National Institute for Strategic Studies in Ukraine under the leadership of the President of Ukraine, Zelensky. And we're talking about the Ukrainian counteroffensive and the outlook for this war. We have currently in Germany this discussion on Taurus missiles. Should they be delivered to Ukraine or not? They are pretty similar on their characteristics to Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles. A bit more better design for hitting bunker targets, and Russian targets was designed like for the Baltic Sea region against the Russian Baltic Fleet. How does it look like this discussion from the Ukrainian point of view? Are Taurus missiles so much needed for Ukraine? What kind of positive effect could this delivery have for Ukraine?
Well, first of all, we appreciate different kind of assistance provided by Germany, especially we value German contribution in air defense segment. It's incredible. It's disproportionate, I would say, securing Ukrainian skies and guaranteeing this segment of security. But the problem is that no war is won by sticking to defense, and that's precisely the scene. And since we've seen quite successful employment of Storm Shadow Scalp, also air launch cruise missiles, that's why there is plenty of targets that might be destroyed by this kind of missiles. The only problem, of course, is that maybe people are having in mind situation in Kherson last year in the right bank of Dnipro, where for Ukraine it was possible to do a full isolation of the theater of military action, given Russian high vulnerability, high dependence, quite few connections across Dnipro. The situation, ongoing situation, I mean, in this offensive operation, given geography, is quite different one. So we would like to destroy fully like these links connecting Chongar and temporary occupied Crimea, which is the shortest road for a supply. But we can do full isolation. That's why we are all for to receive this kind of missiles. There is a lot of targets for them. I subscribe for the idea that since we have a deficit of high explosive projectiles, of the cluster munition projectiles, of other projectiles, it can be compensated with short range ballistic and cruise missiles. There is a lot of target, but of course, compared with Kherson offensive, we can do fully this so-called isolation given the unique features of geography. But no matter, it's better to have a couple of dozens of air launch cruise missiles with the proper range, with the proper payloads, and not to have them.
What are the most crucial goals which the Ukrainian army need to achieve now? Like when we look at the map, we have seen that what you have already perfectly described, that the Ukrainian army is going step by step, pretty slow, like digging through the Russian defense lines, where the Russians have a lot of trenches, minefields, artillery, and other defensive means, and going step by step towards Taurus. What is the operative goal in this development? Is it the northern shore of the Sea of Azov, or is it something else?
Well, of course, there were goals at the beginning of this operation, and it was quite obvious that ultimate goal is physically cutting this so-called land bridge. But right here, right now, for Ukraine to say that our offensive is successful, I would say it would be fine given all the conditions on the ground, given the system of defense created by the Russians, given all the limitations and constraints we have. For Ukraine, it would be fine to come to at least to Tokmak, and from this ground, from these positions, maybe start another offensive, another push forward at the next spring. So for Ukraine, it would be fine at least to come to Tokmak, and that's how I see the situation. There is, of course, these ideas. If Ukraine is successful in coming to Tokmak, we can take under the so-called fire control of all the roads in this land bridge. But well, I am a bit more cautious because to take fully into the fire control, you need to be within the radius of like 40 kilometers, or better even 25 to 30 kilometers. That's why for Ukraine it would be fine to come to the outskirts of Tokmak and solidify control of these territories, and then maybe regroup without allowing Russians to regroup, and replenish the stock and prepare for the next year campaign.
Mhm. Well, when we're talking about Tokmak, like for our audience, if you look at the map, you will see that Tokmak is a very important logistic hub. We have like most roads which are going to Tokmak if you want to have undisturbed logistic supply from the Russian controlled territories of the occupied Donetsk region to like to Kherson region. You need to go through Tokmak. So Tokmak has a very special location. And also, like I've been 2 days ago in Zaporizhia, where I was like where I was in contact with the 47th Mechanized Brigade, and the soldiers explained me that they have like a pretty complicated development going to Tokmak because like when you go to Tokmak, you go upwards because Tokmak is pretty high. It's about like 120, 150 meters higher than the positions of the Ukrainian army now. So they go all the way uphill, and the Russians have like much better positions for shooting, for targeting the Ukrainian units, for shooting at them. And only after they reach Tokmak, they can have this view over the valley. So pretty tricky development. But when we come back like to what we expected from this offensive and what can be reached, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the Kharkiv offensive was very fast because the Russians were not prepared and they had no time to dig the defensive lines. But here we have well prepared defensive lines with a lot of minefields, a lot of artillery, a lot of anti-tank guided missile teams with these Kornets and Fagot and other missiles. And is it so that it is not like that the Ukrainian army need to go like just like 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, and then they come to operative space and can expand, but it is actually many dozens of kilometers of defensive lines. Is it what the Ukrainian army is facing now, and how this situation can be solved?
Well, the problem is that since Russians constructed quite a sophisticated system, you already described most of development elements of this quite sophisticated system. The problem is that while we are breaching this so-called tactical depths of defense, Russians they have a time to construct new lines, and that's why we are constantly in this period of like penetration. Given the slowness of the process, that's why we are not able to move beyond the so-called tactical depths because Russians they have time to create a new tactical depths at a new positions, and that's the major problem. But well, given all the constraints we have, that's the only possible development. Because again, there is the school of thought: if Ukraine is more forceful, if we throw more equipment, if we throw more manpower, it means that even if we lose more people in penetrating this tactical depth, then we can quickly do an exploitation phase, throw maneuver formations, and so on. But as for me, this idea it doesn't work. We've tried it at the beginning of June. We've seen it's quite risky given all the elements in the Russian defense. That's why we are slowly dismantling the Russian system of defense from the other way around. So since there is this problem of minefields connected with artillery, attack helicopters, anti-tank guided missiles, and other things. So to do a demining and move on, so we need first to decrease the effectiveness of the artillery fire of the Russians. That's why a lot of counter battery fight, then to create conditions for the mining and to move on. That's why we see another tactics, and it's quite well, I would say substantive, very deliberate. But yes, it has a downside that it's slow one, and it allows Russians to regroup, allow to create new positions, and we need to start it all way around from the beginning to breach another layer of the tactical defenses.
How helpful is, if any helpful, the Western provided trainings for the Ukrainian soldiers? Uh, could the Western trainings, like if we go like outside of the very technical issues of like how to operate Bradley or a Leopard, how to make repair, like how to operate these techniques, uh, did a tactical training provided by the West help the Ukrainian army to fight the Russian army?
Well, there was a lot of debate, a lot of criticism directed at Ukraine, but I appreciate the fact that there are Western analysts that admit that Western training has also has a kind of deficiencies. And I advise everyone to read the Rusi report, recent one, that outlined this kind of deficiencies, outlined the fact that it's quite difficult to recreate the conditions Ukrainians face on the ground on Western training ranges. I mean, like the ability to create the density of UAVs. Ukrainians need to operate both friendly ones and enemy ones. It's also about the level of training because, again, we appreciate that some kind of basic skills are acquired, but the problem is doing training at the company, battalion, brigade level, and very little time is left to do after some basic training. And that's why there is a good suggestion that let Ukrainians do basic training in Ukraine, and when people move abroad they start training at the company at battalion level. And there is of course this issue that, well, most of the Western training programs, they don't meet the requirements of the warfare in a battlefield currently operated by Ukrainians, because most of these manuals, most of these training programs, they were created for counterinsurgency, and that's why, again, candid analysts, true analysts, objective analysts, they admit that if, for instance, the same kind of assignment is given to like some kind of Western European armed forces, it would be very difficult for them to perform, and who knows what level of proficiency they would demonstrate under conditions Ukrainians operate. That's precisely the reason why we are saying don't teach us how to fight. It doesn't mean that we don't need training. We need training, we need some basic skills. It means that, well, since we have a unique conditions you never faced, and it's not only about air superiority, which is important, it's also about the level of mining, obstacles, system of fire created by Russians, and so on. So don't apply mechanically your own doctrine, your own lessons. That's the reason why when Ukraine are saying don't teach us, or please be more cautious in the advices you provide, it means this kind of thing. It doesn't mean that we don't value, we value training provided by the Western countries, by European countries, by US and so on, but there are a lot of caveats, there is a lot of details, and as I said, a lot of analysts, true analysts, they admit that there is deficiencies in Western training program also, and they need to be remedied. And in general, there is a kind of agreement among experts in public debate when you see who is providing this or that kind of opinion, that it's very difficult to master combined armed warfare at scale in a 1.5 to 2 months, and that's the reality of war. You only acquire skills for real combat. You can't, with any kind, the most sophisticated pre-deployment
Hmm.
training, it would never make troops as prepared as possible for the combat.
Hmm.
So the real opportunity to acquire skills, it's in combat. It means again losses, and that's why again this debate ideas provided that Ukraine need to be more forceful, but we need to preserve as much troop as possible, both to move on, but
Hmm.
also people learn skills, because otherwise you need to learn it once again. I mean, fresh people come and they need to start it again. So that's why there is a lot of things to consider from this offensive, including
Hmm.
the sophistication, the level of training, some nuances, some downsides in a Western training program. That's why we value everything we receive, including training. But let's be honest that there are a room for improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. I have heard stories of trainings provided in the West when the Ukrainian soldiers asked for direct advice, like what should we do when we face a minefield in our offensive, and the advice was, well, like you just like go like 500 meter left or right or 1 mile left or right, and you just like go this minefield around. But it is absolutely impossible. Maybe it's possible in Afghanistan or in Iraq, where the limited amount of mines like was used by the insurgents, like maybe some roads were mined, but the next road was not mined. But in Ukraine, there are like dozens and hundreds of kilometers of minefields. You cannot just go left or right. It is impossible. The same like with the support of artillery, you cannot just go to the hill, take your binocular and observe the field. First, there is no field, there is no hill in Kherson or the Zaporizhia Oblast, and second, you will not survive. the situation where you just stay with your equipment on the top of the hill and try to provide the advice. So the tactics which were okay against insurgents, as you said, they are absolutely useless when you face the Russian army with a lot of artillery, drones, with electronic warfare, with minefields, and with the other means. But if we come back to the situation on the ground, we have concentrated recently discussing the Zaporizhia region, but we still have Donetsk region and Luhansk region, where the Russians try to start some sort of their counteroffensive, which seems to have failed. What are the Russian goals in this summer campaign?
Well, their most important goal, their number one assignment is to repel Ukrainian offensive. That's why they are throwing all the manpower, spare manpower, in Zaporizhia region. That's their number one task. And the activities you mentioned around Kupiansk, it's also directly connected with Zaporizhia region because the main task, along with maybe replaying the results of Balaklia Kupiansk offensive operation done last year by Ukrainian forces, is first and foremost to deflect as much Ukrainian forces as possible. Fortunately, it failed without producing a major exchange of territories. According to Ukrainian data, Russians needed to regroup, and a very small amount of territory changed hands. And Russians, they are still like 8 to 10 kilometers from Kupiansk to the northeast of the Kupiansk. If we are talking about other like major operational excesses in Bakhmut, we have quite good successes, but actually we are facing the limits of what can be done. I mean, we fully reduced Russian salient to the southwest of Bakhmut. We partially reduced Russian salient to the northwest. We pinned as much Russian forces as possible. We recently have reports about Andriivka, and also there is developments going on in Klishchiivka with Russian activities, with Ukrainian activities against Russians. But we are facing the limits because to move on, we need spare uncommitted forces, and we don't have this kind of luxury. And if Ukrainian military command, highest military command, has, for instance, like 2, 3 army corps, for sure, Zaporizhia direction, Melitopol direction, so called, is most promising one, and that is the direction where these forces might have been committed. In around Avdiivka, situation is mostly the same one, with even some local Ukrainian successes around Opetne, but for both Ukraine and Russia, this axis is secondary in terms of how much we can spare compared with other directions. We also have success south to Velika Novosilka, but after like liberation of Staromykhailivka, Staromayorsk, I'm sorry, Staromayorsk, that happened at the beginning of August. Right here, right now, we're trying to reduce Russian salient around Novodonetsk and Novomayorsk, but without success. And in general, the most important part of the front line, it's Zaporizhia region, where the fate of this campaign, the summer part of this campaign, would be decided. That's why, despite both Ukrainian and Russian attempt to deflect attention, to deflect resources, most of the resources are concentrated there by both sides.
Well, we have seen already the Russian attempts to mobilize as much possible manpower. Not only the Russian citizens. We have seen how they try to recruit the Cuban mercenaries, how they forcibly conscript labor migrants from Central Asian countries like Tajikistan and others, like people who came to Russia for jobs, but have been forcibly conscripted or being lied into army. For example, they have been sent to Mariupol, to Russian occupied Mariupol, and it was promised to them that they will work there as construction workers, but they found themselves in the Russian army after all. Can we say that the Russians have some significant amount of manpower resources which is still untapped? Like we are talking about the planned mobilization in Russia for the next month. Is it something that the Russians can do?
Well, nominally Russians have a lot of spare manpower, but again, it's quite nominally, because the issue of another round of official mobilization, if you remember, it was discussed from the January of this year, and for I don't know what kind of reasons, we can debate them, different hypotheses. Putin didn't do this kind of thing. Well, I can say there is a number of reasons that prevented him from doing this. First, for the strategic defense they are currently doing, they need much less, and partial clandestine mobilization that is ongoing constantly for 18 months, it's more or less fine to replenish the losses, because according to a main intelligence directorate, this partial clandestine mobilization is giving the Russians like 20-25,000 troops a month. And for the strategic defense, you need less of manpower compared with the strategic offensive operation. Another issue, well, despite the fact that Putin is autocrat and his autocracy is tending to totalitarian regime, despite this fact, he still might fear the backlash from another round of mobilization. And well, we've already seen what the first round of mobilization attained. All they were able to attain is just to stabilize the front line, and their second offensive in eastern Ukraine, it failed spectacularly with major losses, like 100,000 troops at least died. And well, I suppose that Putin he remembers the lessons of the First World War, when at some period, after a lot of losses, after the desperate state of the Russian armed forces, Imperial Russian Army, they turned their arms against official regime. And again, that's also the issue of control of the armed forces. It's the one thing to control like 500,000 troops. It's another thing to control 1 million troops. I mean, in terms of political control, to prevent some kind of mutiny and so on. We already seen one mutiny. That's why, despite the fact that nominally Russia has a lot of manpower, and this is the argument that is provided by the proponents, let's be honest, by the proponents of the some kind of negotiation with Russia, they are threatening Ukraine. So in this game of exhaustion, you don't have any kind of chance. That's why better for you to do a kind of mobilization. But as for me, this issue with mobilization, why Putin postponed it, why it's still debated, it's a very cautious story. It means that something is of major concern for Putin, why he is not calling mobilization, and that's why not better not to threaten Ukraine with indefinite stock of manpower in Russia compared with Ukrainian man stock, and better learn why Putin is not doing this kind of things. And I suppose even if he's going to do this kind of thing again, it would be maybe 400,000 to plug losses to sustain the front line and nothing else. Because again, as I said, there is a lot of nuances, a lot of issues that are a major concern for Putin. That's why this issue is very important. And when you see that somebody is threatening Ukraine with indefinite Russian manpower, I'm 100% sure next thing he or she is going to do is to say, let Ukraine negotiate, which is a total nonsense, as for me.
Oh, well, thank you for this insight about like the Russian capacities, which are of course not endless as many in the West believe. Like Russia is actually a very small country with not that big part of population, and many Russian males of the conscription age. They're not in the best physical shape, mental shape, like a lot of alcohol consumption problems, etc. But we have a question from the audience. Sasha Ostanin asks, what is happening with Russia's weapons and ammunition production? There are reports that Russia has been increasing its ammunition production and trying to recruit North Korea as an ammo producer. That is actually a very interesting story. That North Korea was pumped by the Soviet weapons in the 50s and 60s, and is not a country which is associated with high-tech military production. And now Russia is suddenly not dependent, but at least asking North Korea to provide like some ammunition and weapons. What is about this development?
Well, all the figures we are provided, it should be put into context. So I also seen these reports that Russia is going both to increase the amount of ammunition produced annually and also to engage North Korea. But all these figures provided, I mean that Russia is going to increase the rate of production from 1 million to 2 million, that maybe North Korea is going to provide something, given the
You
fact that
mean 2 million ammunition, 2 million artillery shells?
2 million artillery shells. Yeah. These stories need to put into context, because there was a figure, public figure provided, that last year Russia used from 10 to 11 million shells, and this year the estimate is that they are going to use 7 million shells. So even if Russia increased this production to 2 million shells, and even if it's able to get from North Korea, I don't know, maybe a couple of 100,000, because North Koreans, they also have their own requirements. They need to threaten Seoul, unfortunately. Also, it's about redundancy rate, because a lot of munitions, they beyond their life expectancy, and they malfunction and so on. That's why even if Russia is able to get more munitions, I'm 100% sure that it's not enough to renew some kind of large offensive, and it's open question whether it would be enough even for successful defense, given the consumption rate. It's still huge by the Russian standards. It's decreased compared with 2022, but it's still huge. That's why all the figures we receive, all the figures we see, it should be put into the context, and context is quite not favorable to Russia.
But when we see it, all these, like we have seen already, all these reports in Russia stated that they will produce like the new tanks, like 100 or 200 tanks produced from scratch by Ural Vagon Zavod, or like refurbishing of all the tanks which have been delivered from the storage depots. And after all, like it all ended to be like a hot air. They were not technically capable to produce that much tanks or artillery pieces, etc. Maybe the same is with the ammunition. We have already seen their promises that they will produce like thousands of new Lancet drones or Shahid drones, but obviously, thank God, they are not capable for that. But if we return back to the question of Ukraine hitting Russian military objects on the territory which is controlled by Russia, or even Russian sovereign territory, like the air base close to Pskov in the northern Russia, northwestern Russia, or the Russian air bases in Kaluga region and Bryansk region. Do we observe now the development that the Ukrainians just push the Russian safety zone further and further from the Ukrainian border, forcing the Russians to operate from a safe distance?
Well, with regards to the so-called in-depth strike and the end goal we're trying to attain, it's an open question for me. I mean, we lack data to assess what is the end goal, but at least first we need to start from the from the recalling that Ukraine start to do some indigenous solutions when last year it was denied ATACMS short-range ballistic missile, and that's why we have the gap of capabilities. And the idea was the following one, and it's a sound one: you can prevail in the war if its war is done in your territory. So we need to do what Russians are doing for us. So they are make as hard as possible, first to leave, and second to do a regrouping of forces. So if we just stick to defense, we won't prevail. There is no way we can prevail, and it is was clearly stated by General Zaluzhny and General Zabrodsky, who is now deputy, one of the deputies of General Zaluzhny. So that's how it started. The second scene important, it's a type of targets we strike. There are at least three types of targets. So first is Moscow proper and these skyscrapers. The second scene is Russian air bases, and its unique feature because air bases are quite vulnerable because Russians, they don't invest in this maintenance in these bases to host this equipment. That's why they're
And
quite.
and the Russian strategic bombers, they don't produce new ones. So you hit one strategic bomber, actually, like Russia cannot replace it.
That's precisely it. Another kind of targets is so-called military industrial plants of different kinds that are producing subcomponents. Another kind of scene, and another, of course, is directly related to the generation, sustainment, and employment of the grouping of forces. This inter-service grouping of forces in the Ukrainian temporary occupied territories. So these are the four kind of targets. They're quite different one. We are striking all of them. And as I've said previously, one of the things we might try to attain is to create as much dilemmas as possible for Russian air defense. So what are you are going to defend with limited stock? Because you need to defend under current conditions and at least three kinds of sites. So first, it's this inter-service grouping of forces that requires air defense that is operated by the Russians in eastern and southern Ukraine. Another is a temporary occupied Crimea, which is major logistical hub for the southern grouping of forces, and another one is a Russia proper. And that's why, despite the fact that Russian army has this advantage of different kinds of air defense system, they have both air defense of the land forces and air defense component in the aviation and space forces, but it's not enough to cover this amount of territory, this amount of side. It might be also Ukrainian end goal. But as I said, so there are at least four types of goals, and to be honest, I'm a proponent of the idea that we need to strike either sites related to the generation, sustainment, and employment of forces, or the ones that generate revenues for Russia, or they are part of military-industrial complex. But again, since I don't have all the information, for me it's very difficult to judge this whole strategic framework applied in these strikes.
Well, that is an amazing insight, and we have seen already in the last year that the Ukrainian offensives they brought success, but they did not end the war out of quite obvious reason because of the massive resources which Russia invested in this war. But Ukraine is going further and further, liberating more and more territories, and now Russians, as you already mentioned, the Russian main goal is to defend what they have already conquered. But that means that the Russians have abandoned the idea, or at least for the next time, to go in offensive. They are in defensive now. That is what nobody could imagine 1 year ago, 1.5 year ago. Ukrainian army is in offensive. Ukrainian army is liberating territory. Ukrainian army is striking Russian territory up to Moscow and up to Russian strategic military bases, and actually like winning initiative and dictating the Russians the development of this war. Thank you so much. Mykola Bielieskov is a research fellow at National Institute for Strategic Studies in Ukraine under the leadership of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He has spent with us his time today, providing us with very with his knowledge and with very deep insights. And I hope to see you soon again. Thank you, Mykola.
Thanks for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. Thank you, everyone who watched it. Don't forget to subscribe, to like, to share. This live interview will be saved. You can rewatch it. You can share it with your friends and ask them to rewatch it. Don't forget to like this channel, to subscribe to this channel, and don't forget to help Ukraine find like your initiative, your charity initiative, most the best way from Ukraine, like life come back and alive initiative for which Mykola is also working, and stay with Ukraine. Thank you so much. Have a great day.